Thank you, Judy. Yes, my name's Emily Dell. I am a filmmaker and screenwriter and scientist myself, but I'm also very proud to be here on behalf of ScreenCraft, which is a screenwriting education and talent discovery platform. We educate the next emerging generations of screenwriters with programs like you see here. But actually, like Judy said, nothing like this has ever been done before. And so I am really excited to dive in. And so I'm going to start with bios quickly for all of our panelists and then into questions. And we hope it just becomes a really interesting conversation between these incredible people sitting next to me. And yes, astronaut Sunita Williams will participate in the Q&A at the end. If anyone has any questions, they're willing to want to fire at her. So sitting to my right is filmmaker Michael Barnett, whose film is playing at 5 o'clock at, let's plug the movie right now. Where?
I don't know where, but it's playing.
Where? Okay, Redfield?
Redfield.
Okay, Redfield, yes. And this is the film The Mars Generation,
Yep.
which was at Sundance this past year and is screened at many other film festivals. And in addition to that, Michael Barnett is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. He's traveled the world for HBO, National Geographic, Discovery, the BBC, and more. His first full-length film, the Emmy-nominated documentary Superheroes, was distributed by HBO, and in 2012, he created Gore Vidal, the United States of Amnesia, which premiered at Tribeca. And in 2015, he partnered with Morgan Spurlock for Becoming Bulletproof, which was chosen by the U.S. State Department to screen in countries worldwide as part of the American Cultural Diplomacy outreach. And The Mars Generation is his most recent film that has garnered rave reviews, and I encourage everyone to go see it. To his left, your right, is Josh Seftel, who is the filmmaker in residence this year at the Woods Hole Film Festival. He directed War, Inc., starring John Cusack, Ben Kingsley, and Marissa Tomei. At age 22, he received his first Emmy nomination for his very first film, the award-winning Lost and Found. And the PBS broadcast of Lost and Found helped thousands of Romanian orphans get adopted and raised hundreds and thousands of dollars for their cause. He's also directed Emmy award-winning premiere season of the groundbreaking Bravo series Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and the Peabody Awards finalist documentary series The Secret Life of Muslims. His stories have been on This American Life, essays on NPR, Salon, CBS, and CBS Sunday Morning. All right. Nice. Then to Josh's left is Kay Foster, officially Nora Kay Foster, but known to us as Kay. An extremely accomplished television writer, executive producer, and what we call showrunner in Hollywood parlance. She and her longtime writing partner, Adam Armus, created and executive produced NBC's American Odyssey. Before that, they were executive producers on the Fox series The Following, and they spent several years with an overall deal at Universal where they ran the hit series Heroes. They started their careers working their way up through 3 David E. Kelley shows and are currently developing a series based on the comic book series Sinatro for Amazon Studios. And interestingly, before that, she had a whole career as an educator and marketing executive. So next to Kay is Doug Young, who is a screenwriter and graduate of NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. His first feature was Confidence, starring Ed Burns and Dustin Hoffman. He's written extensively for television and film, including HBO's Big Love. He's the co-creator of TNT's Dark Blue, and he wrote the Star Trek film, Star Trek Beyond, directed by Justin Lin, which was his second project with J.J. Abrams and Bad Robot. He recently completed production on the TV pilot Scalped, based on an acclaimed DC and Vertigo graphic novel. All right, you guys. Julie Hoover is sitting next to Doug Young.
This is the no Emmy side.
No Emmys over here. No Emmys here.
No Emmys. As you guys may see, we have organized the panel slightly into documentarians, writers, and then scientists. And so we start with the incredible Julie Hoover, who is an associate scientist of marine chemistry and geochemistry at the Woods Hole Oceanographic. She investigates sub-seafloor microbial communities to resolve the function, evolutionary dynamics, and biogeochemical implications of this unexplored ecosystem. The questions that her work addresses are universal for understanding the impact of microbial life on both human and planetary health. and help us understand the diversity of life on Earth and beyond. She works with NASA and also serves as Associate Director of the NSF Science and Technology Center for Dark Energy Biosphere Investigations, whose mission is to explore life beneath the seafloor to advance science, benefit society, and inspire the general public. And then next to Julie is Ken Bissler, the senior scientist of marine chemistry and geochemistry, also at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And his research focuses on upper ocean biogeochemical cycles, studies of scavenging and particle cycling using anthropogenic and naturally occurring radionucleotides, and geochemical studies of the Black Sea using Chernobyl radio tracers, plutonium isotopes, and the behavior of fallout plutonium in the ocean in the aftermath of the Fukushima reactor.
Right?
So then my hard job is done. All right, and so now let's get to the fun stuff. Honestly, I don't know if I need this mic because it seems like there's only one and the rest of us can just talk, right? You guys can
Yeah.
just, so I'd like to start with inspiration, which I think as...
We actually need the mic.
We actually need it, so everybody has to talk it, so we have to pass it down?
No, we're all mic.
We're mic'd.
Oh, so just me? Okay, great. All right, sorry about that. So starting with inspiration, which is, I think, inspiration and imagination is what brings us all here to this film festival. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to name a show, a TV show or film, or any piece of popular entertainment or that ever inspired them about the world and inspired curiosity to learn more. And this could be science, it could be science fiction, or if there wasn't anything like that in entertainment for you, or if there was ever something that really captured your imagination and made you more curious about the world. Who wants to dive in?
For me, it was a book. And actually, it was a book connected to Woods Hole, which was Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us.
Yeah, good book.
And she wrote it just sitting down the street. There's a statue of where she sat when she wrote it. And I read it when I was 11-year-old living in Chicago. And it captured my imagination and thinking about this ocean that I rarely got to see. So it helped move this path. And I love being able to go hang out with Rachel and, do my science here.
Twilight Zone. Is there anybody young enough that does not remember Twilight Zone? So it was all about the fringe areas of science, and I've really been involved in television writing. I've really been involved in the pseudosciences more than the actual hard sciences. I never wrote for CSI and all of that, but I love science, and I love the fact that we're focusing on science more these days, and I think it's an integral part to our writing process, actually. So.
For me, it was, I grew up with a reading disability. And when I would go to the public library in Schenectady, New York with my dad and my sisters, my sisters would get all these books, and I would get stacks of VHS tapes of documentaries. And so for me, it was the documentary films, and just that was my entry point into learning and into discovering the world, and ultimately it became part of my career.
I think mine was like a little bit of protest. Is my mic different than everyone else's? Sounds like. Anyway, when I was a kid, I grew up here in New Hampshire, and there was sort of no potential film school that I could think of, certainly not at the state level, and I went to UNH. And I think I had a proclivity for science and mathematics and sort of just tested into always studying science and mathematics, but I didn't really love it. And when I went to UNH, I studied biology and human genetics and environmental affairs, always knowing that I was not going to do anything with it, that I was going to go out to Los Angeles and be a filmmaker. But strangely, I just spent the last 3 years doing nothing but, studying science and making a film about it. So it all kind of came together in the end, yeah.
Good. For me, it was probably TV shows and movies. And I remember younger watching Star Trek in reruns and having an impact on me that I probably didn't quite understand till later. And then this later in life, I remember watching Blade Runner for the first time on VHS, and that's where I sort of realized that this idea of science and fiction could kind of lead to these bigger questions, ultimately about humanity and who we are and what we are as a species, and that idea that in Star Trek even, that sort of the farther we go out, the more we're actually examining what's inside. And I always sort of felt that was this incredible combination of two great things, which is analytical science and then a sort of more philosophical, humanistic kind of exploration.
Yeah, this introduction, I study things that are radioactive in the ocean, and when I look back, I didn't think at the time, but some of those 60s grainy black and white B movies, the Godzillas, them, all the strange things that happen when you're radioactive, I think that combined with watching things like Jacques Cousteau documentaries and kind of put them together eventually, but I didn't know that, but somehow that must have influenced me, because that's where I am now.
Yeah. You almost have like the real life Godzilla going on. Too, right? I mean,
So is there anything that you think, like, what was it about these stories that grabbed you? Was it character? Was it something you didn't know before?
Well, Twilight Zone, it's an easy thing to talk about because the thing that grabbed me was the kind of morality tale that would be told during each episode. So it would start off with a narration and it would tell us about who the person was, and it would say to us that all of a sudden that little world is about to change, and then it would create this anticipation for you. It was like so exciting, what's going to happen to this person? And it just the thrill of that, I think, was really exciting. Plus it always played out as kind of a morality tale, which I think is interesting. Good guys versus bad guys, and looking inside, which is what Doug said.
there's also, I think, for me, for the element of science and how it's represented, at least the way I respond to it, as opposed to like science fantasy, which arguably you could say is Star Wars and that kind of stuff, which I'm a big fan of, so nobody get upset, is the idea that, you're asked in movies and popular mediums like that to engage in a subjective reality. And you sort of have to suspend your disbelief to a certain extent. And whenever there's something like in Twilight Zone or other things that I like, there's this element of science that feels plausible or maybe even real. And to me, that just adds to the experience of watching a movie or watching television and going, oh, that's a possibility that feels a little bit more real than something that's full-blown,
Right.
Just fantasy. So I always sort of, if you're a storyteller of some kind, that it's another little kind of like thing you can grab onto and hold onto and feels like you relate to that.
I think scientists and storytellers are very much alike because we all ask the question, what if? Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that unites us, the imagination, to answer that what if question.
And science too. I think if you're sharing a story of science, in a way, I mean, sort of my relationship with science from a storytelling perspective, the kind of deeper I go, the less I share something that is, analytical or factual, whatever it may be. It's actually the deeper I go into whatever I'm sort of trying to understand, the more I understand me, and the more I understand sort of the human side of the story I'm trying to share. So it is, I think there's a perfect marriage, right, of the deeper you go when you think about sort of science or space or whatever it may be, the more humanistic your story is going to be. So,
When I one of the films that I found in that library was called The Times of Harvey Milk. Has anyone seen that film? Yeah. And I remember that was the moment when I realized that, like, first of all, what good storytelling is and how a documentary can have this underdog protagonist that you can follow through a part of history. And in some ways, I feel like every time I do a science story, I think about that film, and I think about, to me, scientists often are underdogs. They're people who are working in the shadows, not always, but often working in the shadows, doing something that people don't really understand. They're usually questing to discover something or to understand something better. And that's such a valiant thing to do. And I think that any kind of, if you can tell that kind of underdog story in the right way, it's really compelling. And so science stories can be fantastic because of that.
I think it's an interesting point because in a way it's like science in the broadest sense might be like a search for truth, right? And that idea of like you have to navigate or cut through prejudice, religion, like sort of all these things, politics to get to it, and you're asking so much of people to not adhere to those things that they've learned in some other way and say, well, this is actually the truth. And of course we're seeing that play out every day now with climate change and stuff like that, but it's probably why it's like so challenging in a way or why you would almost say it's an underdog thing, where it's on a sort of objective level you would say, well, why is that an underdog story? That's just people looking for the actual factual truth of something. So
I think the underdog kind of resonates to me a bit. You know, they're never the star, but they're the ones who solve the big problem in 90 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever the show is. So it's fun to think about, you know, the impact you can have without being up front and center.
Right.
I guess that just fit my personality better. And the
Literally
take
save
home
the
though
day.
now is, you know, it's not that easy, right?
Yeah.
Right.
You learn that you
Right.
just don't answer those questions in 30 or 60 minutes.
Yeah.
right. And is it I read somewhere where somebody said that good science means really what you've done is you've just posed the next set of questions, right? So there's no kind of clean bow, we're done,
Right.
let's lock that away and call it a day, right?
That would be a terrifying feeling to run out of questions.
Yeah.
Time to just sail away.
So how important is communication of science? And I'd like to start with Julie and Ken on this, both to educate the public, to inspire the next generation.
I mean, I think it's critically important, and you know, Twitter has changed my life as a science communicator, for example, social media, and it's been nothing but positive. And not only do I feel like I get to communicate with a lot more people because now we can use things like social media, or sometimes when we're at sea, we can even stream video back live, so anyone can pop up on their laptop to YouTube and they can see what we're doing on the sea floor, and you know, the comments and questions. We get questions like, is this Earth? You know, I mean, it's that fantastic, right? These exploding volcanoes or molten lava, you know, is this Mars? You know, those are the types of questions we get, and it's amazing, right, to be able to share that experience outside of, you know, these 50 people sitting on a ship who, while still amazing, you know, we get to see it a lot, we get to participate. And I also think it helps to show the different faces of science, the different, I mean, I think it's amazing you guys think we're heroes, because no one has ever said that before. And you know, I think, you know, bringing together people who are professional storytellers with scientists, it's, you know, it's a wonderful path forward.
My dog thinks I'm a hero.
Oh, okay. There you go.
But communications, you know, I think when you start out, at least for me as a scientist, you're automatically talking to your peers right away. You're talking to others, and that's how you advance what you're doing. But I think more and more as time went on, I realized that in some ways it's sometimes more satisfying way to get that out to a public that should be hearing this, because you can sit in your office, you can do wonderful things, and you can get credit for it, maybe not be called a hero, but ultimately, I feel like my job is to help move something forward that people care about. And how will they know if I just write a treatise in geochemica, cosmochemica acta, you know? You're not going to see that. So we've gone into things like crowdfunding as a way to engage people to take samples.
Interesting.
Once they grab that water and send it to me for radioactivity levels, they want to know what does it mean and stuff. And so I think there are now new things coming out that allow us to reach those audiences. And obviously that's changed a lot in the last decade or so.
I think they're being nice down there. Truth and science are under attack. I think now more than ever it is imperative to put stuff into the world that makes a difference, that perpetuates truth. I mean, I couldn't be more proud of the fact that we have made a film that advocates for science, it advocates for exploration, it advocates for space, and more importantly, it advocates for the education of our youth. So I think communicating this is of the utmost importance right now.
in a way, science needs marketing.
Yeah,
I really need marketing.
I didn't know a single scientist growing up. I never met a
I don't know any
scientist until I went to
until
college.
I met you guys.
Right? And so if you don't even,
If you're not in the community,
right, if
you're
you're
not in
not
the
seeing them on the
community.
screen or reading about them in books or meeting them,
Right.
you know, how are you? I didn't know I wanted to be a scientist. I knew I wanted to understand how the ocean worked.
Right.
Right? Like, I didn't get it. I wanted to understand how it worked. It turned out to do that, I had to be a scientist. And so I think the more we can expose the public to scientists, the better.
When
Yeah.
several years ago, I was making a film about cancer researchers at MIT, and I was meeting these and interviewing these amazing people who were having like major breakthroughs in searching for the cure for cancer, and some of them had won Nobel Prizes and all kinds of incredible awards. And I looked at this list of people that I'd met, and I had never heard of any of them.
Right.
I didn't know anything about them, never heard their name before, didn't know about their work. And then I was thinking, I was like, but I think I know what kind of iced tea Kim Kardashian likes to drink. And that was so upsetting to me when that moment that I realized that. And that's when I pitched a series to Nova on PBS, a digital series called The Secret Life of Scientists. And I said, I want to tell stories about scientists that you've never heard before. I want to know about their lives. I want to know about their hobbies. I want to know about very personal details. I want to humanize them. I want to create a set of films that will serve to provide people, like younger people, like to
With
look and say
models.
like role models and say like, oh, well, look
Right.
at that person. They're like me, or they're doing this thing, and that's really interesting, and I see the human side of
Right.
them. And so for the last 7 years, we've been making this series, and it's we've made over 300 short films now that are out on the web and are free to watch. And we've had, I think, over 50 million views, and have gotten some really nice letters from kids who've been inspired. And
really great.
but that's just one drop in the bucket. I think there needs to be more going on by people like you, and making films that tell science stories in a way that are inspiring, accessible, and provide role models and an understanding of what it means to be a scientist.
And what's the series again?
It's called The Secret Life of Scientists.
Secret Life.
It's part of the Nova
Okay.
strand. Yeah.
Great.
Because I think that we're hoping that this panel kind of sparks something that continues, that's maybe an initiative or if nothing else, new relationships. What can we all be doing? How can we be better working together to communicate these issues?
Meeting one another is a good start.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm always looking for great stories. I mean, all storytellers are. I'm sure that
Yeah,
everyone from
absolutely.
the middle down is looking for inspiration wherever they can find it. So, yeah, any line of communication that gets open between a scientific community and a storyteller is a good thing. So,
One thing I've noticed, and you guys could probably speak to this better, but is that when I started producing, I produced things for Nova, and when I started out, a lot of the scientists I met were reluctant to make their science too accessible, and they spoke about it in a very jargony way that I couldn't understand, and not all of them, but some. And I would always say, you don't know how many times I've said this line, speak to me as if I'm in 5th grade. Can you do that for me? Because that will make this film better. And I know that's insulting in a way to scientists, but it's a start, and it's a way to begin the conversation and to present the information to the general public. And
it's almost not their job, though, to make it accessible. It's yours.
well, right, that's true. But I've noticed that more and more and I don't know if the culture is changing. You guys can speak to this, but I feel like the culture is changing from what I've seen, where scientists are more interested in people like me when they come to them, and they're more interested in finding a way to make their content accessible, their work accessible. And that seems like a fairly new thing. I feel like it was almost frowned upon to talk to the sort of pop media about your work, but now it seems like it's okay a little bit. Maybe you guys can speak to that.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's this line where you're afraid, you're afraid of how it's going to be perceived in the media, right?
Okay.
And like they get it wrong,
Yeah.
and that, I've had some angry people call me, and that's uncomfortable. But I do think, I see it with our grad students and such. They're really interested in science communication. They want training in it. I've taken a couple trainings. Alan Alda's Center for Science Communication did a one-day workshop with his group. And I don't think it's insulting to talk like I'm a fifth grader, because if I can't convince a fifth grader that life at the bottom of the ocean is important, I'm never going to convince anybody, right? And these are the future taxpayers, these are the future protectors of our planet, right? And so I think I have to be able to talk to anybody about my science, whether it's Ken or you guys or elementary school students. And I do think we could serve as better mentors if we were better trained in it. And so some of those are really kind of volunteer opportunities we've taken on. But I think for future generations, I see a little more access to formal training, which is helpful.
Yeah, and it's not usually, part of the job description, I think, is what kept
Absolutely.
us away from it, or your promotions, right? It's not about talking to public audiences that gets you tenure at a place like Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So there's that history too, that, well, why would you do this? Maybe there's a little more incentive now, just because I think a higher fraction of funding comes from foundations, from individual donors, from a public that's eager to contribute in any way they can sometimes. So that's kind of shifted a bit too. So I think we have an incentive. I think we should have that self-motivation, but there's also, the reality that we're not seeing big budget increases in Washington, D.C. anytime soon. And, if you want to convince other people that what you do is important, that's our obligation too. And meeting people like you to help make that case is part of that.
I think we can rename the panel, Making Science Sexy Through Marketing and Media.
See, I got in trouble for calling something sexy in science. People were not, I called the Alvin submersible. I said diving in it it's the sexiest thing out there in science, and I got in trouble. But besides being an astronaut, traveling to the seafloor in a submarine, it's pretty darn sexy.
Pretty cool.
But I was scolded.
Going to space is pretty cool too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems sexy.
I'd like to talk to, and I want to start this with Michael and Josh, but anyone can jump in. When you're depicting something that is grounded in real science, how important is research, and what's your process?
It's everything. Research and journalism is how I approach everything. And then it's my job to sort of, put it through the sausage grinder, spit it out so it's accessible and entertaining and cinematic, but truthful. Whoever's coming to our film later, it is dense, it's ambitious, it has a lot of information in it, it has years of research in it, years and years. So it's everything. It's very, very important, especially for telling science stories. If you get anything wrong, people are unkind, to say the least. They're looking for a mistake.
I feel like the science part, it's important, but in some ways that's the easy part. It's the trying to break through, to get to know the scientist and to get them to open up as a person, to get them to, I always like to figure out, how do I get inside their head? How do I... I just got inside someone's head. That's what it sounds like.
And that's how you do it. I've got to use a needle now.
How I want to know their thought process. I want to know, how do you attack a problem? What goes through your mind? How do you find the inspiration? What do you feel like when you have that aha moment? And so I've discovered, one story I did, the guy talked to me about how when he's thinking, he just paces all the time. He's just pacing back and forth and back and forth. And then he has these breakthroughs. And this is the guy who discovered CAPTCHA. Do you know what CAPTCHA is? It's when you type when you're going into a website and you have to type in those little numbers. So when I told his story on film, he was pacing the entire time. And so there was a visual of getting inside his head. You know, another guy talked to me about how every day he varies his routine. So one day he'll wake up and he'll brush his teeth, and then he washes his face, and then he makes coffee. And then the next day he does it in a different order. And that's how he keeps his mind fresh. And then he gets these ideas when he's doing that. And so in that film, we had him brushing his teeth, and every day he did it in a different order, and you always saw that. And I feel like finding those little quirks, those little human details that let us inside someone's thought process really help to tell the stories and help to let us into the human part of science and the creative process of doing science, because I think it is a creative endeavor in some ways. And so that's the part I find to be the most challenging, and I love discovering that part of it and figuring out how to tell that part of it.
I find that kind of interesting because I never think the story is really about us, it's about what we've discovered, right? But I can see your point if you're trying to convey that, get someone energized, but that's not normally how we think.
Right.
I have a slightly different experience with research and stuff, and I've done a few things that have science fiction, and they require a consultation with scientists. And I think one of the things that happens in Hollywood anyway is that there is this kind of desire to have that research and have that scientific accuracy, but for what we do in a strictly more narrative sense, you're often trying to get that stuff to bend into what you need it to be. So
It's the servant to the story.
right, and I think part of the problem why, like a lot of people who I know who are into science and accuracy, they always say, well, why would you do that? Because that would never happen. And of course not, but there is a sort of desire for that you see on all levels. I'm talking like studios and the sort of the machinations of how movies get made, where that quickly gets sidelined by the billion other factors that kind of come in. So I think too often there's this desire for that in the sort of early stages where you can kind of say, tell me, like a fifth grader, how this would happen. And it all gets laid out, and you're good until point 10, where you go, okay, that destroys the whole movie. And you end up trying to, I've been on the other side of the table where I find myself going, yeah, but what if that happened? And it's funny, you see this negotiation that I've had experiences with other scientists where they kind of go, you see the kind of their bullshit meter, doing this constantly, And like you sort of can tell that if you're like around there, they're okay with that. But if you go to that, they're like, listen, we can't, I no longer want to have lunch
Don't put
with
my
you.
name on
Yeah,
the movie.
exactly. And so it's a little bit of having the, setting the, designing the sort of vessel for all of that, the story to say it's necessary that we keep this amount of accuracy. Otherwise, it's kind of just becomes an exercise and sort of it's no hold barred and you sort of have anything can sort of go. But so I think that's one thing that in movies and television shows, we could all be a little bit better at that, communicating the desire for it to have that accuracy and consulting more with people who really know what they're talking about, and not just kind of going like, but we need an asteroid to hit Earth, and it needs to happen next year. It's that kind of. How do they not know it's going to hit Earth? So it's sort of all those like little things that I think just there's some responsibility to say, at least for the strictly fiction stuff. Like, all right, we're going to try to err a little bit more towards that.
There's a good side, a downside, and a good side to that. And the good side is that by writers showing women doing science like detective work and forensics, the numbers have gone up in grad school and in schools for all of the women participating in forensic science from television writing. So that's the good side of the, no DNA comes back overnight. We all know that, but nevertheless, In television it does, and things happen much more quickly. The same is true, I must say, my writing partner and I did a lot of legal shows, and the same is true with legal shows, which is that we tell the audience how to think about the law, and then when they go into the courtroom, they're expecting that, like on the OJ case, where they expect a certain level of fictionalized, exhibits, and so it gums the works up in many ways, on the good side and on the bad side.
Yeah. There's also a little bit, I think, how science is depicted in a lot of Hollywood things that, like, we're not helping the cause.
No, absolutely not.
You think about it, it's like the scientists are either the tropes are they're either like the mad genius who's going to
The evil
destroy the
one.
world,
Right.
or he's the guy in the back going, "I'm telling you, that's not how it's going to happen." And like how
It's like the age-old argument. When I found out I was going to be on the panel, I kept thinking about Ray Bradbury's short story, which I couldn't find, and if I'm wrong about this, correct me. But there was a story where a man was sitting on a train and he had a wristwatch on, and in that wristwatch he could talk to his wife on the phone. And that was written in the 50s, the 60s, or whatever. And I thought, that will never happen. That's crazy. So, it's like the invention of things comes about because scientists do the hard work, but some of it comes about because the ideas are out there.
Sure.
And that gives them a goal to reach for and a thing to hit, a target to hit.
Yeah, I was going to add on to your comment about this place. And, I can put up with
Bullshit
it.
is what I said.
Yeah, I can put up with a lot of BS for a good story, but I do think that having science represented in a more diverse manner, even if it's a bunch of BS, would be more helpful, right?
Right.
So, women are often portrayed as a little bit neurotic or like a little bit too sexy or something, there's some
Right.
weird little place that men get a much fuller range, it appears.
Like the pinnacle of that was in a Bond movie when the actress Denise Richards played a nuclear physicist. It was like,
The casting there, not
Yeah,
quite
but-
right.
So I think, even in science fiction and science fantasy, filling those roles, with more different colors and genders and races would help a lot.
Which is happening. We
yeah.
were talking about that.
But also just the depiction of, there's again, this is a little bit, I'm speaking a little bit in cliche, but that idea of like, there's in popular entertainment, there seems to be this idea of like let's dumb everything down to the lowest common denominator so that the broadest spectrum of people can understand precisely what we're talking about.
Right.
And I mean, take the movie like The Martian, which I was impressed with the movie just in the sense that they didn't really care to stop and explain
Yeah.
every little detail of the chemical components of this, that, and the other. Or I should say, when they did, they didn't stop to say, time out, now let's put it in layman's terms for you.
Right.
So,
Film has good science.
yeah.
I thought it was
It
a
does,
love
right?
song to science
Yeah.
and
I was going to say, I
engineering.
hope you're not, denigrating the science there, because I thought it was real.
I thought it was
No,
wonderful.
Good.
but it's again, it's saying we're going to embrace that in this way, and if you can keep up, great. But if you can't, maybe we'll pique your curiosity enough to go look it up or something. Or on another sense, like I was talking about before, it adds a level of reality to the situation that just helps you immerse more and engage more and become more sort of invested in the actual story. So, it's like, to me, that's a good example of how it can be represented in a
But I
kind
think
of
The Martian's a good example of actually having good science, because everybody can then get on board with the film knowing that it looks a lot like how it's going to look.
Yeah.
So then it makes it, I don't know, I think more compelling, emotional, right?
Right,
So science can serve a story in that way
Right.
and
right.
enhance the experience.
Right. I'm curious for you guys, like, just, I was thinking about this, like, what, do you guys often go to movies and you just sit there and you're shaking your head the whole time?
I've never watched Sharknado, but that's on the other side.
All right.
Bullshit movie. Or when New York freezes over and the wolves come out in like,
Yeah.
3 hours or whatever.
Ooh, Day After Tomorrow. I love that movie.
There's definitely a few that go way beyond
Yeah.
my bullshit meter, but
Right.
The Martian is a great one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if they come out being fantastic, Guardians of the Galaxy, I don't know, if it's a fun movie that might have some elements, that's okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I just cringe when they get things like totally wrong. There was a Mars movie many years ago that got the genetic code wrong, which is ATGC. They got the fourth one wrong.
Out of 4, they got
Yeah,
it wrong? Oh,
and
wow.
they got it wrong.
That were
right?
maybe 16 screenwriters.
So I just, I
Right.
mean,
3 out of 4 is not bad.
that's what,
That's acceptable to Hollywood, yeah. That's acceptable, right.
2 out of 2 is acceptable.
They're like, wait, so it's 75%? We're good with that.
we wouldn't have
Sounds
jobs
like you're not
with
gonna
that, right? No. So I think there is that place between not trying to tell them too much, right? Or just getting all in. So I loved The Martian. I mean, I was practically in tears. I thought,
good.
you know, watching the engineers at the Jet Propulsion Lab try to figure this
Right.
out, like, how are we going to do this? I thought it was incredibly compelling.
Right. And how dramatic that
It
you
was
can
so
say, we
dramatic.
have to figure out this algorithm. And
Yeah.
everybody goes, oh my God, it's life and death. And it feels
Right.
as, you know, sort of urgent and
Yeah.
dramatic as,
Yeah,
you know.
I thought it was great.
So I grew up in a family where my father was a physician, and when we would watch St. Elsewhere or Quincy or whatever, like he would just sit there and he'd be like, "That's totally bullshit. That's wrong. That's wrong. That's wrong." And I just wonder, like, I'm curious to hear from you guys, like, how do, like, as a documentary guy, when I do documentary, I'm always pushing it as far toward like drama as I
Yeah.
can. Like, I'm trying to use the conventions of movies, Hollywood movies, to tell my stories, but I always have to tell the truth. So I'm constrained by that. But how do you guys, can it be brought, like how can you guys improve the genre of science in movies? How can you do it better so that, you know, it's still really compelling,
Right.
but it's accurate or close to accurate?
I can only speak from my experience, but certainly like a movie like Star Trek is a further out. And again, like Trekkies are people you don't want to get on the wrong side of. So there's a kind of more, but there's a little more leeway there, you know, like you can understand that. But I think one of the things, I'm doing a project now that's based on a real life person, and it's about privatized space. And the engineers I've spoken to, they give it to you and they give you the naked sort of facts. And it's like what you were saying, which is like you do have to put it through a little bit of a sausage grinder to go. It's going to be, you know, like on some level, it starts to become abstract because you just don't understand all of those things. But if you can distill it down into something that's digestible and real, and even if it's just a sense of that seems accurate, it's not too neat, it's not too tidy, it's not too sort of just sort of convenient that it's that. I think that helps. You know, I think there's another thing too, though, where it's like, at least this is my experience, so I'm not.
Okay.
You tend to do a lot of research in the beginning, like in the sort of blue sky, anything's possible, this is going to be the greatest thing ever stage. But when you end up with a thing, I don't know a lot of people who go, dear sir, scientist, could you read this now and point out all the mistakes?
Yeah,
Because
not going to happen.
right, I think that's actually sort of a little bit of a mistake. You know?
Yeah.
I think that's something
that is
that could.
very, I mean, our film had to go through Fact Check at Time Magazine.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a very different process.
You're into education more? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, actual fact-based
It'd be
education.
nice to be able to.
We're into fantasy entertainment, popcorn, eating,
Right. But
dark theater going.
It's no excuse, though, in the sense that it really is our jobs. If the commitment is to that, the powers that be, again, the millions of people who come in and voice their opinions on these things as they're getting made, it really is, though, sort of it's one of our things where we have to sort of stand up and say,
Yes.
I'm building a wall around this because it just like I don't believe that father would say that to his son. I don't believe in any world that science would hold up.
Right,
Right.
right, right,
And
right.
so, you know, it sort of has to be adopted into that sort of realm of they're all things that have to feel right and help the story along, or else.
Right.
Yeah, we've always done. I mean, maybe not. Maybe it's just me. I've certainly written things where I've been like, I can't get behind that 100% because
It's-
I'm
Right.
sort of, you know, being accommodating to somebody else's desire or whatever the thing is.
The thing you have to know about writing for television and writing for features, it's very collaborative. And so you don't actually have the final say. I mean, even in television, you don't have the final say. And of course, in features, you don't because the director's the person who has the final say. So, you know, a lot of
Sometimes
things.
not even him.
Not
or
even
her, yeah.
him or her, maybe the studio or, you know, yeah,
Right.
exactly. So we only have so much control over things. But I like to be accurate if I can. I think it's important to educate people when they watch things, that they can learn something, because I think that's part of what I like. What I enjoy about life is learning new things. So if possible, for sure. But if it's strictly a kind of a fantasy thing, it's hard, other than, doing the psychology of the characters and working with human emotions to bring those to the fore.
So, Ken and Julie, is there something that you wish, other than, let's get the genetic code correctly, is there something that you guys wish that was communicated better, or something that you often see, like it would be an easy fix, or something that you'd really like that a spotlight isn't shined on in a way that you feel like it should be?
One thing did people see Chasing Coral? I know a few people were there yesterday. The scientific process, it's not just about facts. Did you get the facts right? But just this idea that they were working to take pictures, photographs underwater of coral bleaching in real time, and they made these fancy instruments and they didn't work. And that's a very common experience. They didn't give up, they went on, but it often seems to be lacking that in a very short period of time to get to the end result. And I think that whole process of you've got a question, how are you going to answer it? You go down many more paths that don't really provide the answer than you do that get you where you want to be. And working that in, I think that movie did a good job of just showing that, and that became part of the drama in some ways of that film, was showing things don't always work. It's not because we don't try, it's because you don't know.
I hear it's really good. Is it good? I hear it's really good. Yeah.
I think something that also is sometimes missing for me is my science is really personal. Like, it's a very emotional thing for me. I have wanted to study the ocean my entire life. I take it very seriously, and I take it home with me. I wake up with it. And I feel like sometimes the emotion, and how personal it is taken out of a lot of these stories. And it sounds like you're trying to bring it back in a little bit. And I really appreciate that, because I don't know how many movies or documentaries I've seen about the struggling actor, trying to make it, all this rejection and failure and all these things, and then the final success. But, that happens in every career, and just because we're fact-based, it doesn't mean there isn't this very emotional connection to it. And I think, especially in Woods Hole, right? I mean, we've all committed our lives to the ocean, or, understanding it. And for many of us, that's very personal.
When your research is very cutting edge, as it is for both of you and a lot of what's done at Hui, how much, are you ever asking what if in the same way that writers do? Are you ever kind of pushing your own imagination forward?
Oh, I'm not sure about the writers, but that's kind of what you're always trying to figure out, ways to answer things that no one else has done, right? I don't want to sound too grand about this, because they're often really small steps, small improvements in one technique or chemical analyses get you a little bit closer. The aha moments are rare. For me, it's more when you put all that stuff together that you can reach those moments. But you're being asked to support yourself by answering questions that haven't been answered, at least in a research environment. So that is there all the time. And you don't, like you said, going home, this is the kind of thing I'm glad I love my job, because, as my wife will tell you, I'm thinking about things all the time, late at night, in the morning, it's not something you turn off and go home and do something else. It's there.
Yeah, and I think for me, being willing to take the calls from the popular media has made me push my imagination, because they will easily ask those questions, So what does that mean for finding life on Enceladus? And I'll be like, okay, we're going right there. This paper that was about, extreme microbes on Earth, now we're going to go talk about life on Saturn's moon. And that's really fun, though, right? And that is part of what inspired me to stay in science, and especially to go into the deep ocean, which is not an easy place to work. But it was thinking about, the really big questions. Are we alone in the universe? If we aren't alone, how are we going to figure it out? And what are we going to do here to help us figure it out? And what is it going to mean? Like, these are really, really big questions. And they absolutely inspire me.
So this is kind of like one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A. And if there aren't any from the audience, I have 1,000 more. But to Ken and Julie, is there anything you're working on right now that like is really, really cool and should be in a movie?
Wait, hold on.
Want to go first?
It's gonna be my pen out.
No, right. No, you go first. Or I don't know.
Movie-wise. Yeah, that's a tough question, you know, because the types of things that I'm working on relate to either climate controls, and so there's a lot of potential there. But really what the public has been more engaged in my work is about radioactivity and when is it safe to be somewhere. And we did a lot of work after the Fukushima disaster 6 years ago now. Fortunate to go back 2 years ago to the Marshall Islands, where we conducted purposeful nuclear weapons tests. And it's kind of interesting, they're asking at both of these sites the same questions. Is it safe to go back? They still can't answer that 70 years later at the Marshall Islands, much less 6 years later in Japan. And so I am working with a production group in Boston. They're trying to think of principal pictures, doing something with that. They were along on one of our cruises. You know, research, being on the ocean is kind of a cool thing. And so I think even though I don't work with charismatic megafauna and whales and things, I think there are stories that could be told around a legitimate research question that might, I think, engage other audiences. So that's one example.
Yeah, and I mean, my Enceladus example is a good one, right? And so in the last few years, especially here in Woods Hole, we've tried to bring space scientists closer together with ocean scientists, because now some of the best targets in our solar system for finding life are moons that we think have oceans. So, you know, sometimes they might be under an icy shell, or other times, like Enceladus, there's just something being spewed out into space that we're catching with a flyby. And, you know, as ocean scientists, we go out in these ships and we're trying to detect and find life using advanced robotics. We're using telepresence. Sometimes we're looking for life that's barely eking by, you know, and I think kind of connecting what we're doing in the deep ocean to space scientists, it's very compelling, you know. Like I said, when we stream these live videos and people ask, is this Earth? You know, they have already opened their imagination to it, you know, even before maybe many of us have. And so I think it's a wonderful, you know, it's exciting stuff.
Well, being a storyteller, I hear her say that, and my brain immediately goes into overdrive, because I start to think about if you can ask yourself maybe two or three of the most profound existential questions. It would be, you know, is there a God or gods? Is there, are we alone in the universe, and where did we come from, right? Maybe those are the three most profound things we can ask ourselves. And what you're saying is that what you're doing might eventually lead to an answer to maybe two or three of those questions.
Definitely not three, just to be clear.
But if science can provide an answer to two of three of those questions, you know, and we can frame it that way, I think that's worth pursuing, both in continuing the work you do and in continuing the work that I do. So.